Welcome to another episode of Beautiful, Bad and Bizarre. Today we're going to explore the life of the comedy legend Kenneth Williams. In a small terraced house shared by two other families at 11 Bingfield Street off the Caledonian Road north of King's Cross in London, an iconic legend of comedy was born. Kenneth Charles Williams made his debut in one of the two rooms occupied by his parents on Monday the 22nd of February 1926 at 2:30 in the afternoon. Kenneth's mother, Louisa, and his hairdresser father, Charlie, had been married for 10 months. Kenneth was their first child together. Charlie had been at the birth, which was a rare thing in those days, but it just so happened to be his usual afternoon off work. During a previous relationship, Louisa had given birth to a daughter in April 1923, who she'd called Alice Patricia. She'd been engaged to be married and became pregnant just before the wedding. Her husband-to-be abandoned her when he found out about the pregnancy. Termination was illegal and it was a disgrace to be pregnant and not married in those days. So her sister Edie and her sister's husband informally adopted baby Alice. Soon after Kenneth was born, the family moved to 3 rooms in Cromer Street and Alice Patricia was returned to Louisa, who was forever grateful to her sister and brother-in-law for caring for Alice, who was now known by her middle name, Pat. Charlie would unofficially adopt Pat as his own daughter. Kenneth's father, Charlie, was strict, and he and Kenneth did not often get along well, but Kenneth was the apple of his mother's eye, and they were always to remain close. Louisa was a great influence on Kenneth's life. He said she was a brilliant impersonator, and that he felt he inherited her sense of humour and her ability to impersonate people. Both of Kenneth's parents were volatile and temperamental, and it seems he also inherited those traits. Talking about his mother, Kenneth recalled that she would rush out saying, "I've got to do the shopping," but instead she'd go to the pub for a gin and tonic with her friend and they would sing pub songs. Kenneth said he learned all of his pub songs from his mother. Eventually, the family moved to a flat above the hairdresser's shop Charlie managed. It was in Marchmont Street. Charlie was regularly rude to his customers, especially the women, and when they would ask to have their hair coloured, he would respond with, "Do you want to look like a tart? Stick to your own colour. You can't improve on nature. You ought to know that. You're old enough and ugly enough." Kenneth was always incredulous that it never lost his father customers. At school, Kenneth took part in school plays and he developed a passion for art, poetry and impersonations. Kenneth's impersonations would often get him into trouble. And on one occasion, in the playground at Manchester Street Junior School, Kenneth had been entertaining his classmates with an impersonation of the schoolmaster. The schoolmaster suddenly appeared behind Kenneth, who, unaware, continued his impersonation until his admiring audience stopped giggling and he realised the master was behind him. Kenneth, however, had no remorse and later said it was water off of a duck's back. A similar incident took place when he was a young actor, entertaining his peers with an impression of the director, Cecil King. When he realised Cecil had just witnessed the entire performance, Kenneth was to say in his autobiography, Just Williams, I'll leave a link in the description of this video, that during his youth he learned a lot about derision, but precious little about diplomacy. Charlie wanted Kenneth to follow him into hairdressing, but, much to Charlie's disgust, his son was only interested in art and acting, neither of which he approved of, and although Charlie was insistent Kenneth get a trade, he eventually accepted Kenneth had a skill for drawing and agreed to let him train as a draftsman. Kenneth also infuriated his father, who had a Cockney accent, by speaking in what was considered then as a posh accent, and Charlie would ask his son, "What do you go around with a plum in your mouth for? putting it on, giving yourself airs. Charlie did not approve of what he considered his son's effeminate ways. Kenneth later said, "My father wanted a football-playing, beer-drinking son, and he got a gin-drinking poetry reader." The friction would continue until Saturday the 13th of October 1962, when it was discovered that Charlie had swallowed a poisonous cleaning fluid from a bottle that had previously contained cough mixture. Louisa dialed 999 and Charlie was rushed to hospital, where he initially appeared to be making a recovery until 3 p.m. on Sunday the 14th of October, when Charlie suddenly deteriorated and died. At the inquest, his death certificate recorded a verdict of accidental death, with the cause being bronchopneumonia and acute gastroenteritis following carbon tetrachloride poisoning self-administered by accident. However, Kenneth believed his father had taken his own life. Returning to 1940, Kenneth Williams was to experience, like so many other children in London, being taken away from the family unit with the outbreak of World War II, and at the age of 14 he was evacuated to Bicester in Oxfordshire. Lined up with other children, potential foster families came to choose the child they wanted. At the end of the day, as darkness fell, Kenneth and a few others remained without a family. They were handed over to the district nurse for the night, and when Kenneth asked her why he'd not been chosen, she told him, "Because you've got a nasty sneer on your face, that's why." He was eventually to board with an elderly vet called John Chisholm, who was in his 70s and lived in Sheep Street, Bicester, with his housekeeper. Kenneth was enthralled and remembered the vet's home as a magical abode where Chisholm would recite poetry and sing very loudly. On a trip to check up on where her son was living, Louisa was horrified at how dirty the house was, with mouse droppings in the kitchen. In 1941, Kenneth Williams returned home to the family in London. Due to his academic abilities, Kenneth gained a scholarship to attend Parliament Hill Secondary School. However, his parents were not prepared to spend the money on a uniform and books, and so he went to Lyoff Stanley Central School for Boys in Mornington Crescent instead. As a result of this, Kenneth Williams always felt educationally inadequate, a feeling that would stay with him for his entire life. A teacher remarked to his father that Kenneth showed off to disguise an inferiority complex. In his autobiography, Kenneth admitted, "My exhibitionism concealed a sense of inadequacy." Christmas 1941, now aged 15, Kenneth Williams was given his first diary, in which he recorded his weight as being 7 stone 2 and height 5 feet 3 inches. And from there on in, with a few exceptions, he would keep a journal for the rest of his life. After his death, some of the contents of his diaries were revealed and would upset a great many friends. Just before his 18th birthday, Kenneth Williams was requested to attend a medical as a preliminary to receiving his call-up papers. Having passed his medical, on the 20th of April 1944, he arrived at Carlisle Castle for army training. Due to his draftsman's skills, Kenneth was ordered to report to the Royal Engineers Survey Training Centre in Ruabon, Denbighshire. In 1945, Kenneth Williams was shocked to be posted overseas, although he wouldn't see active service. His tour included India, Burma, Singapore and Ceylon. It was during this time that he utilised his considerable talents that he had honed entertaining his classmates, and he was soon entertaining his fellow troops, along with another member of the concert party who would become a close, lifelong friend, the comedian Stanley Baxter. Demobbed in 1947, Kenneth joined Newquay Rep and began his stage career in earnest. He was loved by the audience, who particularly enjoyed his reviews. They found his sharp innuendos and sexual ambivalence of his characters completely captivating and hilarious. Kenneth Williams was also a competent, serious actor, appearing in Shakespeare and working alongside great actors such as Sir Laurence Olivier in The Beggar's Opera and Orson Welles in Moby Dick. The public adored Kenneth's mock, over-the-top outrage, and he first found national fame on the radio show Hancock's Half Hour. His catchphrases were an instant hit, and along with his hilarious radio characters came Beyond Our Ken and Round the Horn, which fully established Kenneth Williams in the hearts of the listening public. He was the master of giving apparently innocent lines a whole new meaning. But it was the Carry On films that cemented the legend of Kenneth Williams in British comedy history. Beginning with Carry On Sergeant in 1958, Kenneth Williams would go on to appear in 26 of the 31 films made. That included one tribute film, more than any other cast member. It will be easier to name the Carry On films Kenneth Williams didn't appear in, which were Carry On Cabby, 1963, Carry On Up the Jungle, 1970, Carry On Girls, 1973, Carry On England, 1976, and finally Carry On Columbus, 1992. Kenneth Williams could at times be quite prickly to know and didn't get on with everyone. He could be caustic to the nth degree. However, Barbara Windsor said she got on fantastically with Kenneth, to the point that he went with her on her honeymoon, and that he just took to her, which she treated as a compliment because she'd been told, "You don't choose Kenneth as a friend, he chooses you." Barbara said he was a terrible snob, and on one occasion on their way back to set, he put his arm round her and said, "I really love you, Bar. You're the only person around here who cleans their teeth after lunch." Other close friends were Joan Sims and Hattie Jakes. Hattie would throw the most amazing Christmas Day dinner parties for all her friends, with Kenneth Williams and Joan Sims never missing a Christmas Day dinner with Hattie. Kenneth Williams, for all his extrovert ways, actually had an incredibly shy and sensitive side. He lived a very minimalistic life, and he was not given to inviting people into his home. On one occasion, Hattie and Joan gate-crashed his flat, insisting on being let in. Joan told the story in her autobiography, High Spirits, published in 2000. The sitting room was totally bare. There was no television, and just about the only item of furniture was a lectern in the middle of the room. The walls were lined with hundreds of books, but there were no other personal items of any sort. It was almost like a hospital ward, so clinical. While I hardly ever saw him quiet in public, I could imagine that this was where he found his peace. One area of the flat that remained resolutely out of bounds. "You can't use my lavatory," he insisted, and we could only reply with, "We don't want to use your bloody lavatory." While Kenneth Williams' preference was for same-sex relationships, he also casually asked several women to marry him, including the Scottish actress Annette Carr, who sweetly turned him down by saying it would never work out, her smalls in the bathroom were inevitable. He also asked Joan Sims to marry him. She was to say, "I was dumbfounded and scarcely knew what to say. I had no desire to hurt his feelings, but the idea of marrying him was bizarre." In the end, Joan responded with, "Thanks, Kenny darling, but what's in it for me?" She said at this, the old Kenneth Williams suddenly snapped back into place, responding, "Oh, nothing but sand," and the proposal was never mentioned again. At times, Kenneth Williams appeared to be excruciatingly uncomfortable with his sexuality and never seemed to come to terms with it. He once said, "I couldn't write a lurid type of book about my sexual conquests because I don't have any. I never felt the urge." Kenneth also had a fear of germs and was always complaining about minor ailments and was considered a hypochondriac. This also prevented him from getting physically close to people. He said, I'm sure that love affairs involve a great deal of sleeping around, and I have a horror of germs. However, he did have some serious medical issues that made life uncomfortable, including an ulcer. Kenneth did have both sexual and platonic relationships with men that would often progress into deep and lasting friendships, but failed to progress into steady long-term physical love affairs. Kenneth Williams was complex in the extreme. He could be warm and affectionate on the one hand, and waspish to the point of outright nasty on the other hand, in both personal relationships and with people in general. I will be addressing this in more detail in a future video. On Friday, the 15th of April 1988, Kenneth Charles Williams was discovered dead in his flat, which was adjacent to his mother's flat in Marylebone, London. When his mother Louisa discovered her son, he was lying in bed, still in his pyjamas, and he appeared to have died during the night. Louisa was in shock and inconsolable. Kenneth was just 62. Kenneth Williams' funeral took place on Friday the 22nd of April 1988. It was a very private funeral, attended by a few close friends and family members at St Marylebone Crematorium, now known as East Finchley Crematorium. It was a very simple 30-minute service. Kenneth's agent said that Kenneth Williams wanted no publicity at his funeral, and there were no flowers by request. In death, Kenneth was as minimalistic as in life. There was just 17 mourners, including his sister Pat and 87-year-old mother Louisa, as well as Maggie Smith, Barbara Windsor and Rona Anderson with her husband Gordon Jackson and Stanley Baxter. Barbara Windsor said that afterwards they went to the home of ITV producer David Bell, and that they all realised that although they all knew each other independently, none of them had been out together with Kenneth. Barbara said he liked to keep them all compartmentalised, it seemed. Stanley Baxter, for instance, was his best friend, but when Kenny walked into an Italian restaurant with Maggie Smith and saw Stanley sitting there on his own, he didn't even say hello to him. He just said, "We can't eat here, Maggie. Let's go somewhere else." A memorial service was held at St Paul's in Covent Garden on Thursday the 29th of September 1988, where many friends and colleagues gathered to celebrate the life of Kenneth Williams. The actor Derek Nemo said of Kenneth, "He was a great communicator with the most filthy mind. Often, at his most outrageous, he even shocked himself." David Hatch, who was then the BBC's managing director of network radio, said, "He knew where the British funny bone was located and tickled it at will for 40 years. While there were rumours that Kenneth took his own life, this is just speculation. Tellingly, he'd not made provisions for his adored mother in his will, most likely because he did not expect her to outlive him. But he did leave money to friends who he expected to look after his mother, should he by chance die before her." Kenneth Williams did suffer with serious bouts of depression, and he had confided in people towards the end of his life that the pain he was in with the ulcer and the decline in his mother's own health was almost too much to bear at times, and he longed for it to be over. Once telling friends, nobody should live past 65, which added fuel to the theories that Kenneth took his own life. However, he was in great pain with the ulcer, and that day he'd just been told he needed an emergency operation, which had frightened him. Unable to sleep that night, he took his regular medication and added a sleeping tablet, which unknowingly to Kenneth was not compatible with his other medication, and it caused him to suffer a cardiac arrest. There is no evidence that he intended to take his own life.